To get started with our content for zoology, and what I've decided to do this year is we are going to look a little bit at animal classification before we actually get started talking about the different types of phyla that we are going to cover throughout the year. And so chapter 10 in your textbook is going to be the chapter that you can refer to if you have any questions regarding the information that I'm presenting in today's video. All right, so the first thing I want you to think about is why in the world would we want to classify something? And so if you think about classification, you walk into a store, things are being classified all the time. I mean, if you think about where are the pet supplies, where are the cleaning supplies, where do they keep the clothing, the groceries, etc., things are always being classified. And if you look at the picture here, if you step into a Walmart, say, for example, you were making your way to the aisle that had all the school supplies. And if you notice from this picture, there's all these different types of school supplies that you might purchase before school starts. But if you look here, you're going to notice there's just two items. We have a pencil and we have a pen. And so you got to think to yourself, why in the world would we put those two items together? And so in this case, what we're looking at is we're looking at writing utensils. And so then you have to think to yourself, why in the world would we put these two items together? And then, of course, we know that these two items are responsible for allowing us to be able to write something on a piece of paper. So this is a very, very refined, very specific group of items. The one over here on the right, again, this is a much larger group. And so as we go through and we talk about the classification of organisms, animals particularly, you're going to notice that there's going to be different groups that have different numbers of organisms, and it's all based on the similarities that we see between those different organisms. And so when you think about classification, classification is simple. It's just the grouping of objects based on similarities. But if you're talking about classification in regards to science, there's an actual science or a discipline where you can actually become a person who specializes in classification. You would become a taxonomist. You would be part of a group that basically studies the taxonomy of living things. And so now what we need to do is we need to look at a couple of people that are really, really significant when it comes down to classification. And the first person is a man by the name of Aristotle. And he lived between 384 and 322 BC. And he was one of the first people to actually classify living things. And he placed his living things into two groups. He placed them into a group called the plants and a group called animals. And then he continued to subdivide that group. And one of the characteristics that he used was not necessarily a characteristic of the organism itself, but he decided to subdivide the groups based on habitat. And so what he had noticed is that there are some organisms within that group that might live on the land. There are some that actually would live in the sea. And then, of course, there are some that he could see might spend the majority of their time in the air. A second individual that I want you to make sure that you're aware of is a man by the name of Carlus Linnaeus. And when you talk about Carlus Linnaeus, he lived between 1707 and 1778. And what he did is he kind of took what Aristotle did, but he decided to use physical and structural similarities to group his organisms. Now, in addition to classifying organisms based on the physical and the structural similarities, he also developed a system of naming organisms, and he called this system binomial nomenclature. And what he did is he gave each species a unique two-part scientific name. And the first part of that scientific name is going to be the genus, and the second part is going to be the species. And if you look down here towards the bottom, we have a mouse over here on the right-hand side. And his scientific name, I think, is musculus. And so if you notice, that first part of his name is going to be the genus, and the second part is going to be his species name. If you think about us, for example, we have a two-part scientific name. And the first part of our scientific name, the genus part, is going to be Homo. And the second part is going to be our species name. And in this case, it's going to be sapiens. So when you think about binomial nomenclature, again, just scientific naming, again, we have a genus, and that's going to be this one. And again, as I had said before, Rufus, in this case, for this particular animal right over here, is going to be this wolf species name. Now, there are some rules that need to be followed when it comes down to scientific naming, and these rules are universal across the globe. And the first rule that you need to follow is that you always capitalize the genus name. The second rule that you need to follow is that first letter of the species name needs to be lowercase. And then the third rule is going to depend on how you represent it. In other words, if you're going to type the name, then it's very important that you make sure that you italicize that name. Now, if you have to handwrite the name, then since you can't italicize, what you can do in its place is you can underline the scientific name. But to make that scientific name correct, to represent it correctly, you need to make sure that you follow these 4 rules. Now, of course, we all know that we don't really speak about different organisms in regards to their scientific name. Typically, what we do is we use something called their common name. And this is basically what we're going to refer to the organism in everyday life. And so if you think about the Canis rufus, it's asking, what is the common name for Canis rufus? And so I'm not quite sure if you can see this, but right up here, in this case, this is the red wolf. And so if you were talking with somebody about wolves, the likelihood of you using Canis rufus is probably pretty small. But when you talk about a red wolf, more people are going to recognize what that animal is based on that common name. All right, so what I want you to do is we're going to do a little bit of scientific name practice. And so I want you to think about the 5 different scientific names that you see here. So we have one for the cheetah, one for the buffalo, the pig, the weasel, and the dragon. And these are Latin names, so they're kind of hard to pronounce, and so I'm not even going to attempt it. But I want you to, if you need to pause the video for maybe a minute or two, take a look at 1 through 5, think about the rules for scientific naming, and then you simply have to tell me whether or not that scientific name is correct. I'm going to give you a chance to do that. All right, so looking at the scientific name for number 1, again, thinking about the rules that we need to follow. The first rule being, is the genus capitalized? In this case, yes, the genus is capitalized. Is that species name lowercase, that very first letter? In this case, it is. Then the third rule, which is kind of depends again on the situation. So in this case, since we are typing the name, you would make sure that the name itself is italicized. And in this case, it is. And so this one, we can do a check. All right, so this scientific name is correct. Then we look at the one for the buffalo. Again, genus is capitalized, good. But in this case, they capitalized the species name. And so in this case, if you represented this maybe in a scientific paper, that is the incorrect way to represent a scientific name. But remember, that third rule is you can italicize or underline. So in this case, if you were handwriting it, that would be okay. Now, we did type it here. If you decided to underline it instead of italicize it in a paper that you might present to me, I would be okay with that. But again, typically is whether or not you're typing or handwriting that you would underline. But this one, definitely not correct. Number 3, for the guinea pig, again, capitalized. That's good. For the genus, but again, they decided to capitalize the species name, and plus, they did not italicize it, all right? And so again, this one would not be correct. For the weasel, again, they did capitalize the genus. They did lowercase for the first letter in the species name, which is good, but they did forget to italicize or underline. So we can't accept the one for the weasel as well. So for the Komodo dragon, again, capital here, lowercase for the species, and it is italicized, so that one would be correct as well. So on this screen, what we're doing is we're simply kind of comparing 4 different types of cats. And so all 4 of these belong to the genus Panthera. And so if you notice, that's the first part of all 4 of these cats' names. But you do notice that the species name is different. So what that tells you is that they all belong to the same species, but they're just different enough that they are considered different species. And it's typically whether or not they can actually reproduce with each other and produce fertile offspring. So in this case, Leo is going to represent the lion. In this case, it's going to be the jaguar. In this case, again, same genus, but different species. This is the leopard. And again, the tiger is on the far right. And what I do kind of like to point out about this particular slide is that if you notice, the jaguar and the leopard are actually pretty similar to each other in terms of appearance, but because they cannot produce fertile offspring with each other, they might be able to reproduce with each other and produce kittens, but those kittens would not be able to reproduce. They are actually different species. So when you think about classification, again, you got to think about, there's primarily 8 different levels of classification when you talk about classifying living organisms, and we call those groups taxa. So again, they can be classified beyond just genus and species. Taxa are the categories into which related organisms are placed, and if you have to use it in its singular sense, the word that you would use would be taxon, depending on the context of how you're discussing that word. So these are considered taxonomic levels on this screen. And so what you see on the far right here is we have the grizzly bear, the black bear, the panda, the red fox, the Albert squirrel or the Abert squirrel, the coral snake, and the sea star. And so typically you go from the largest, in other words, the most broadest category right here, all the way down to the most refined or the most specific category, which is going to be species at the bottom, so largest to smallest. So when I was in school, we did not learn about a category called a domain. So we learned primarily kingdom through species. And so this one's actually relatively new and it's just been recently added. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at the screen on the far right, again, looking at these different animals. And if you think about for the kingdom Animalia, so again, we're not talking domain right now, just the kingdom Animalia, all of these animals, all 7 of them belong to the kingdom Animalia, so they can be grouped together. When you get down here to Chordata, these are animals with backbones. A sea star does not have a backbone, so it does not belong in this group, but these 7 do. Excuse me, but these, let's see, 6 do. These 6 do. When you look at Mammalia, this particular snake right here is not considered a mammal, and so these 5 animals belong to the category Mammalia. Carnivores, we do not consider the squirrel a carnivore, even though there are squirrels out there who they'll take insects and maybe some smaller animals if they get a chance to. But these 4 animals right here are definitely carnivores. The fox does not fall into this family, Ursidae, but these 3 do. And this panda does not fall into this genus Ursus. And of course, this particular black bear does not fall into the species Ursus arctos, which is the grizzly bear, right? Now, something I would maybe suggest that you do is come up with some sort of mnemonic device to help you remember these different categories. And again, when I was in school, we didn't have the domain, so I didn't have to add this first part. And I actually learned it, King Philip came over for good spaghetti. That was the mnemonic device that my teacher had taught us. Down here towards the bottom, I gave you one that you could use, or you can create your own. It's totally up to you. Dangerous kings play chess on fine gold stools. So this is just a tool that you can use to help you remember the order of these different taxonomic levels. So on this screen, again, it's just another example of kind of showing you how you would organize the different taxonomic levels based on maybe a species that you are trying to identify. In this case, it's the Blackburnian warbler, and so that would be the common name for this particular bird. And so again, this would be the most general down to the most specific. And so if you look down here, there's the bird in question. But as we make our way up, of course, you're going to find more members within those groups because, of course, the group becomes more broad. And so if you notice, down here. And something I did forget to tell you also is that sometimes you can actually have subgroups for each of these orders as well. And so you could have a subspecies, and you could even have a subgenus, and there could be superfamilies. And so there can be a few nuances with this classification scheme that we're really not going to get into. I'm just making you guys responsible for knowing these 7 different levels. And don't forget that domain is up here at the very top. So once again, as I had mentioned before, the domains that I had mentioned in the previous couple of slides, that's a relatively new addition to the classification scheme. And so we have 3 different domains, and these domains are subdivided into 6 different kingdoms. And again, this class is going to primarily focus on animals. And so we're going to look at the kingdom Animalia. But we also have the kingdom Plantae, which are the plants, fungi, which are the fungus and the mold and the mushrooms. These 3 that you see here are primarily multicellular. The one you see right here in the middle, the Protista, those are going to be eukaryotic, so complex cells, but they are usually unicellular, but there are a few multicellular protists that like to kind of form colonies. They kind of stick together. And then we have, of course, the other two kingdoms, which is the eubacteria and the archaeobacteria. And these are unicellular prokaryotic organisms. And so over here on the left, again, a really brief rundown of each of the different domains. Again, archaea is going to be the prokaryotic organisms like bacteria. But what's kind of unique and kind of sets them apart from the eubacteria is that they like to live in extreme environmental conditions. And so we're talking really super high temperatures that would not be good for most bacteria, maybe even really low temperatures, high salinities, maybe extremely high pHs, or maybe extremely low pHs, maybe a very acidic environment. Again, the eubacteria are your typical bacteria. Again, they are prokaryotic organisms, but these are the ones that tend to fall within more normal environmental ranges. And then the eukarya are the ones that we fall into. So those were going to be, again, the plantae, the animalia, and the fungi. Those are going to be those three, and the protistas right here. And so, again, they're eukaryotic, complex cells, again, organelles within the cells, and primarily multicellular. So looking at this screen, again, still focusing on, in this case, again, we're kind of ignoring the domain, so just those 7 levels of classification. We're making comparisons between these 3, human, chimpanzee, and house cat. You can sort of visualize how they're related to each other based on their level of classification and what that level is called. So in this case, all 3 of these organisms fall within the kingdom Animalia. All 3 of these have backbone, so they would all fall within the phylum Chordata. All 3 of these are considered mammals, and so they would all fall within the same class. And so that makes all 3 of these related to each other in reference to those 3 levels. But as we look at the orders, you're going to notice the human and the chimpanzee are related, more closely related to each other than maybe the chimpanzee and the house cat. Because if you notice, the human and the chimpanzee are primates. The house cat falls into the order Carnivora. For the family, this is when things start to sort of separate a bit more. So Hominidae, Punginidae, Felidae, they each have different families. Again, the genuses are different, Homo, Pan, and Felis. And then, of course, for humans, Sapiens is the species, Troglodytes is going to be the chimpanzee, then Familiaris is going to be the species for the house cat. So I want you guys to think, again, this is going to be a really quick check, and again, you can pause the video if you want to, just to think about it, but how is a scientific name different from the classification scheme of an organism? Think about that for a second. So if you think about it, you need to be able to distinguish between these two. They're related to each other, but there's a few minute differences. Again, when you think about classification, you have to think about all of those different levels. So again, we have 8 of those, so domain all the way down to species. But if you're thinking about a scientific name, then what you're doing there is simply focusing on the genus and the species. And again, in this case, when you're thinking about Canis, that's going to be a type of dog. And then, of course, the species name for this very attractive pooch here is going to be Familiaris, right? So it's the familiar dog, basically, that we're sort of used to. So there is a little bit of a difference between the two. So they're not one and the same, but they are definitely related to each other. So again, those 6 kingdoms, all right? Again, you need to make sure that you're aware of what they are. And so if you think about it, the first one we had looked at was the eubacteria. Again, remember really quick, those unicellular prokaryotes. They can make their own food. They could be autotrophs or they could be consumers, heterotrophs. They tend to reproduce asexually, and there's no sexual reproduction going on here, and these are the modern bacteria. So those are not the extremophiles. Those are not the ones that live in those extreme environments. The ones that live in the extreme environments are the archaeobacteria. And so again, still bacteria, still prokaryotes. They can make their own food or they could be consumers. They do reproduce asexually, and as I said, they are the extremophiles. The protista is the group where these are eukaryotes, and so now we have cells with organelles or cell parts. They can produce their own food. or they could be consumers. They do tend to still reproduce asexually, even though there are some exceptions to that now in this case with these particular organisms. And a couple of examples would be the euglena and the amoeba would fall into this category. Fungi is the other kingdom that we need to be aware of. Again, these could be unicellular or multicellular. They are eukaryotes. They are consumers. They do not make their own food. The mushrooms and the mold. So when you see those mushrooms in your backyard, they are not photosynthesizing. They cannot make their own food. They are consumers. In fact, they break down the organic material in their environment. They can reproduce asexually, or they now have the capability to reproduce sexually, but typically it's going to be through spores. Animals, of course, which is what our focus is going to be, are definitely multicellular eukaryotes. They are consumers, even though there might be a few exceptions to that, but it's typically with symbiotic relationships. Sexually is the way they tend to reproduce. Again, there can be some exceptions there. Reptiles, birds, and mammals. And then, of course, we have the plants, and these are going to be the multicellular eukaryotes. Again, they are complex cells. They do make their own food, but then again, like I said, there are a few exceptions. Mostly sexual reproduction, so again, pollen is going to be part of that. Of course, that's going to be the male reproductive cell to fertilize the female part. But there are definitely quite a few situations where they do reproduce asexually, and of course, examples, and there's lots of them out there: trees, flowers, and of course, all right, so that's going to finish up this particular screencast. And again, it's really important that you make sure that you fill out the worksheet that I had provided to you, because that's going to serve as your set of notes for this particular video.